Hello, welcome to dot points PS12 and PS13. And these dot points are looking at specifications. So first we need to assess the quality and quantity of the product, and then we need to analyze market specifications for the product. So first of all, we need to look at what these specifications are and what they're needed for. So specifications are basically criteria that producers aim for when preparing their beef for market. So they're basically things that the beef must have, and markets require them. So they'll say we need to have a fat depth of this or a marbling score of this much. And that way farmers know what they're actually aiming for. If you don't have a goal and a measurable goal, then you can't meet it. So on the other hand, if specifications aren't met for a market, the price is either downgraded so they get less money, or the animal might be sold to a different market. So for example, the Australian market likes really lean beef and lighter, younger carcasses. And so if it gets too old, and because you haven't been able to feed it enough, and by the time you get some good pasture, the animal's too old and maybe might end up being too heavy eventually, you might sell it to the American market or the Japanese market or something like that, instead of the Australian market. So obviously Australian beef competes with other meats and other beef from other countries to sell to places overseas. So it's important that we meet specifications and do a good job of it as well, and to help us remain competitive. So here I've given an example of some various specifications. I'm just going to tell you about them briefly. But fat depth is basically a measure of the subcutaneous fat, which means under the skin. So different markets prefer different depths. And so here we have a fat depth, and the fat depth relates to a score. So this is a fat score, and each fat score has its own depth. So for example, the Australian market likes, as I said, leaner animals, so 5 to 16 millimeters at the P8 site spelled wrong there. The Japanese standard is much higher, so a higher fat score because they are marbled, so they require a much heavier, larger amount of fat because they are marbled, generally the ones we send. So in terms of how producers can control it, they can obviously breed an animal, and they can choose animals that have put on fat more easily, but also in particular, fat is usually put on in a feedlot. So by feeding animals on grain, and it will fatten them up because they're getting a higher energy diet. So it's normally assessed manually when the animal's alive by feeling over its back hip bone rib area, and it's called the P8 site, and it gives you an indication of its fat score while it's alive. Fat color is rated on a scale here, and fat is either white or on the way to being yellow, this yellowy color here. And basically, it doesn't really say anything about the quality, but consumers expect normally for their fat to be a certain color. So for example, if you're talking about Woolies and Coles beef, you would normally go to a supermarket and expect the fat to be white, and quite simply, white fat comes from feeding the animals grain in a feedlot. And if you get the yellow fat down this end, that comes from feeding them grass. So you might hear of grass-fed beef, which people pay more money for. And the reason that it is yellow fat is because it's grass-fed. So it gets the color from the grass. But if it's been fed grains for over 100 days before it's slaughtered, the fat is white. So basically, people who buy meat, your average everyday person who buys meat from a supermarket, generally expects their fat to be white, and if they see it's yellow, they'll think the piece of meat is off. But yellow fat means that it's grass-fed, and some people pay more money in high-priced butchers for grass-fed beef. So technically, ones that are grass-fed and have yellow fat are worth more money, even though it doesn't necessarily change the quality of the meat. Marbling. Now, marbling is the fourth place that animals put down fat. They do it first around organs, then subcutaneous under the skin, then they put it between muscle fibers, and then lastly they put it within the muscle. So marbling is the little specks of fat that are actually within the fiber of the muscle, and it's ranked on a 1 to 12 scale here. You can see 1 being virtually none and 12 being a very large amount. And we sell, in Australia we don't eat much Wagyu, or what much marbled beef at all. People aren't really used to it. But in Japan, we sell a lot of Angus and Wagyu beef that's highly marbled from kind of 8 up to 12. We sell a lot of that to Japanese consumers in Japan. So we make quite a bit of money out of it. So it's important that we get that. There's basically two ways that you can change it. You either change it by breeding or feeding. So breeding animals, Wagyu and Angus are the ones that can marble. So by breeding in those animals into your herd, then it's going to increase marbling. But then they also have to be feedlotted and eat lots and lots of grain. And the longer they eat grain for, the more marbling is going to occur. And this is just obviously fat deposited, and it's really tasty because when you cook it, this fat in here melts at a lower temperature, and so it melts and makes the beef really tender and juicy, and it's really nice. So I've already mentioned how the producer can control it. So the muscle score here is just the amount of muscle the animal has on it. So you can see A is quite heavily muscled, and you can see that in the diagram here, and it moves all the way down to E being very little muscle. You can see almost the hip bones there, and it's just very little muscle. And there's two ways that well, actually, in terms of the quality, obviously the more muscle it has, the bigger amount of meat, because we obviously eat the muscle. It's what we call meat. So the more muscle, the better on an animal, and the carcass is going to be better quality if it has more meat or more muscle. So a higher muscle score is better. And ways that you can change this are you can choose animals that tend to put on muscle more quickly, more easily, that have a better muscle score, and you can breed those animals together. And then obviously feeding them as well, a good diet for good weight gain will allow them to put on muscle quickly. And so this is the measurement scale here, and I've already told you how producers can control it. Ribeye area. Ribeye is one of the best cuts of meat on the animal, and so the actual size of it down here is measured in square centimeters, and the size of it is determined mostly by breed. So you can choose animals that have better ribeye area, and you can breed those together, and then you can feed them a good diet, and they'll increase the ribeye area. So that's measured, and farmers find out what size the ribeye area is. pH and meat color. So I'm going to relate these to pH and meat color and pH and tenderness together. Basically, the pH of meat when the animal is slaughtered needs to be between 5.3 and 5.7. If it doesn't get down to that, the meat will be dark and tough. And people obviously don't want dark meat. They like it light, kind of cherry red, and then they don't like it tough either, obviously. So basically what happens when a cow is slaughtered, they have glucose, stored energy in their muscles, and that glucose turns, when the animal is slaughtered, it turns into lactic acid. And so the lactic acid drops the pH down to 5.3 to 5.7. So the reason that it wouldn't get down to 5.3 to 5.7 and it would be 5.8 or higher, which would give you dark meat, the reason that would happen is because the animal has been stressed out before slaughter, hasn't been fed enough, so it doesn't have the glucose stored in its muscle, and therefore when it's killed, there's not enough glucose to turn into lactic acid to drop the pH down to 5.3 to 5.7. And that's what causes dark and tough meat. And so obviously producers can fix that mostly by how they handle the animal, keeping it calm, stress-free during production, but particularly before slaughter, and making sure they've kind of fed reasonably, not too much before slaughter, but that they have enough glucose stored in their muscles. And so obviously that's measured the same way as pH is measured normally elsewhere, and it's measured on the carcass of the animal once it's slaughtered. There's an example of the pH 5.3 to 5.7. That's obviously within range. It's a nice color meat, and then it gets darker and darker. And obviously people wouldn't want to eat that. The last one, weight and maturity and ossification. So ossification is referring to the amount of bone. So cartilage turning into bone as the animal gets older. Basically, it's a specification because the more ossification is, it indicates the animal is older and more mature. And so the older an animal becomes, the tougher its meat becomes and the lower quality it becomes. So they want to have a lower ossification score, that less bone, younger animal, more tender meat is basically the answer here. And this is the example of carcass maturity getting older, and that's an example. Ways that you control it. Obviously, if you have fast maturing cattle that can get to a good weight earlier, that is going to improve the ossification score because the animal will be younger when it gets to full maturity weight, which is good for quality and tenderness. So for this dot point or these dot points, it'd be good if you really need to know 3 specifications. You can choose which ones you want to learn, but I've just given you an example here. You can do 2 more on your own. I've given you marbling, and I said what it measures: level of intramuscular fat. It's measured 1 to 12. Highest level of marbling is very expensive. Generally, Australians do not consume much marbled beef, but 8 to 12 marbling scores sold on the Japanese market, and you control it by breeding Wagyu and Angus, and then also grain feeding in a feedlot. And you should do 2 and 3 there as well. The only questions that have been specifically asked on this dot point is asked about elsewhere, and it'll help you. The information will help you answer other questions that are somewhat related, but this is the only ones that are directly related. So describe a specification the farm product must meet for a particular market. That's this one here. Japanese market, 8 to 12, breeding Angus or Wagyu will help you do it. Explain the purpose of 2 name mark specifications. So again, you should always be doing this. It says 2, so you say 1, pH of meat, 2, fat depth, and then I've given an explain. So a cause and then an effect, cause and effect of each, and you need to do that really clearly to get the full marks there.